Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hello, welcome back to Unbound. Today's chapter, I'm going to get into one of the most emotionally chaotic seasons of my life. This was a time when joy and terror and drama and hope kind of all arrived at the exact same moment. This chapter is about survival, motherhood after loss, and the way that past trauma can crash into the present with a force you pretty much never see coming. This is chapter 15 in the book, When the Past Collides with the Present. In 2005, I learned that life has a way of testing every assumption you've made about your own strength, your capacity for hope, and your ability to handle multiple crises at once. It started with Brian feeling unwell. Nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue and some unexplained symptoms that seemed minor enough to ignore. But when they persisted, we finally made a doctor's appointment. The x-ray showed something in his neck area that made the radiologist go very quiet, very quickly. We need to run some tests, the doctor said, in that careful tone medical professionals use when they're trying not to panic you while simultaneously preparing you for the worst possible news. The word cancer was dropped like a death sentence we weren't ready to hear. We sat in that sterile waiting room the next day, holding hands and trying to make small talk about anything other than the possibility that my husband, my safe harbor, my future, my entire life, might be seriously ill. I'd already lost one love to violence. The thought of losing another to disease felt like more than I could survive. But the test results brought news that was somehow both better and worse than cancer. Brian had an aortic aneurysm, a potentially fatal weakness in the wall of his aorta that could rupture at any moment. We need to operate immediately, the surgeon explained. This is the kind of thing that kills people without warning. My world tilted sideways. After everything I'd survived, after building a life I'd never thought I'd be lucky enough to have, I was facing the possibility of losing it all to a medical emergency no one had seen coming. But life, apparently, wasn't done testing me yet. While waiting in the doctor's office for Brian's diagnosis, more than a week before his surgery was scheduled, Brian turned to me and said, "You've been acting like such a bitch. Maybe you should take a test." He was being silly, trying to lighten the mood in the only way he knew how. Of course I was stressed. Of course I was irritable. My husband had just been told he had a potentially fatal aortic aneurysm. But something about the way he said it made me pause. I took the test out of spite. More out of spite than anything else, ready to prove him wrong, to show him that my stress was completely justified and had nothing to do with hormones. Positive. I stared at those two pink lines and the world tilted once again. After years of being told we probably couldn't have children, after the devastating loss in 2004, I was pregnant again, and my husband was about to have life-threatening surgery. I stared at those two pink lines and felt something I'd never felt before, the simultaneous terror of potentially losing everything and the desperate hope of potentially gaining everything. When I showed Brian the test, when I watched his face transform from concern to shock to something like wonder, I saw hope flicker to life in his eyes. "Oh," he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "You're about to have surgery," I said, because my brain couldn't process both realities at once. "Then I guess I have to make it through," he said. "I have to be here for this, for you, for the baby." He was happy, genuinely, purely happy in a way I hadn't seen since before the diagnosis. And underneath the fear, underneath the terror of potentially losing him, I felt it too. That flutter of hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd get to have this after all. Brian knew all my fears, knew about Kier, knew about the loss in 2004, knew how terrified I was of losing another baby, but he also knew how desperately I wanted this. "We're going to be okay," he said, and I sure tried to believe him. Brian went into surgery about a week and a half later, and I spent 8 hours in a hospital waiting room making deals with God that I'm not sure I had any right to make. "If I have to choose," I whispered to whoever might be listening, "let me keep Brian. I'll give up the baby if I have to, but please don't take Brian." It felt like betrayal even as I thought it, but I wasn't ready to be a widow at 29. I wasn't ready to raise a child alone. I wasn't ready to lose the person who taught me that love could be safe and stable and uncomplicated. The surgery took longer than expected. There were complications. At one point, a nurse came out to tell me Brian was holding his own, which is medical speak for he's alive, but it's touch and go. I sat in that waiting room, one hand on my already pudgy, overweight stomach, and wondered how I'd survive it if I lost both of them. But Brian pulled through. Battered, exhausted, facing months of recovery, but alive. And somehow, miraculously, so was the baby. The next several months involved a ton of hospital visits, recovery protocols, and the strange cognitive dissonance of caring for someone who's critically ill while growing a baby inside you. Brian was motivated to recover in a way doctors said they rarely saw. Every painful physical therapy session, every setback, every moment when he could have given up, he pushed through because he wanted to be there when our baby was born. "I'm not missing this," he'd say when the pain got bad. "I've already waited too long for this." I'd sit with him during recovery sessions, one hand on my growing belly, watching him work to regain his strength. We were both fighting for the same future. Him fighting to survive, me fighting to carry this pregnancy to term, both of us fighting to believe that good things could actually happen to us. There were occasional setbacks, complications, moments when I wasn't sure he was going to make it. I spent so much time in the doctor's office, the staff started recognizing me, offering me coffee and asking how I was holding up. I wasn't holding up particularly well, but I was holding up. The pregnancy progressed normally, which felt like a miracle after everything that had gone wrong the year before. Every doctor's appointment where the heartbeat was strong, every milestone we reached felt like a small victory against the chaos that had taken over our lives. But I was carrying a secret that I couldn't tell anyone. I desperately wanted this baby to be a girl. Not because I didn't love boys, not because there was anything wrong with having a son, but because Kier was my boy. Kier would always be my boy. And I wasn't sure my heart was big enough to love another boy without feeling like I was betraying the memory of the one I'd lost. I knew it was irrational. I knew that babies aren't replacements for other babies, that love doesn't work that way. But grief isn't rational, and the heart wants what it wants. Logic be damned. When we found out at the ultrasound that we were having a boy, I cried. Not tears of joy, not the happy tears that expectant mothers are supposed to cry when they find out their baby is healthy. Tears of disappointment and confusion and a grief I couldn't fully explain to anyone, including myself. Brian held my hand and asked if I was okay, and I lied and said I was just overwhelmed by everything that had been happening. But really, I was mourning the daughter I'd imagined, the uncomplicated joy I thought I'd feel, the simple happiness that seemed to elude me even in moments that should have been purely celebratory. But later, when we were driving from that ultrasound, when I could finally be honest about the complicated emotions churning through me, I told Brian the truth. "I wanted a girl," I said quietly. "I know that sounds terrible. I know it doesn't make sense." I couldn't finish the sentence because I never really spoke about Kier with Brian. "He will be awesome," Brian said enthusiastically. "He's his own person and we're going to love him for who he is." He was right, of course, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two completely different things. It was during that conversation that we decided on his name, Crew. Strong, unique, completely his own. A name I'd heard a couple years prior about a boy with the same name who had saved his father's life. Brian felt this baby saved his. Brian was supportive in a way that made me love him even more. He didn't try to fix my grief or tell me I shouldn't feel what I was feeling. He just held space for all of it. The joy and the fear and the complicated emotions that came with bringing a boy into the world when I'd lost a boy before. As the pregnancy progressed and Brian's health stabilized, I started to make peace with the idea of having a son. I bought baby clothes and imagined what it would be like to hold a healthy baby after years of loss and disappointment. I let myself get excited about the future in a way I hadn't dared to before. But trauma has a way of showing up when you least expect it, in moments when you think you're finally safe. I passed my original due date and my doctor said she wanted to induce. A few days later, we did just that. Everything seemed normal at first. Contractions, excitement, the sense that we were finally going to meet this baby we waited so long for. But labor stretched on and on. 32 hours of contractions that weren't quite strong enough, progress that wasn't quite fast enough, a baby who seemed reluctant to make his entrance into the world. By hour 30, my body was starting to go into shock. My blood pressure dropped and the baby's heart rate became erratic. "We need to do an emergency C-section," the doctor said, and suddenly the room filled with people moving very quickly and very purposefully. They wheeled me into the operating room, transferred me to a table, and began preparing for surgery. And then they strapped my arms down. And then they put an oxygen mask over my face. And suddenly I wasn't in a hospital in 2006 having my son. I was in that room on New Year's Eve, 1993, with Brandon's hand over my mouth and nose, unable to breathe, unable to move, unable to escape. The panic hit me really fucking hard. My whole body started shaking. I tried to shake my head, tried to communicate to Brian that something was wrong, that I needed the mask off, that I couldn't breathe. I was trying to communicate to Brian that I needed the mask off. I needed my arms free. I needed to be able to move, to breathe, to escape. I was shaking my head as much as I could, trying to catch his eye, trying to make him understand that this wasn't normal surgical nerves. This was full-blown panic, a trauma response so powerful it was overriding everything else. Brian could see something was desperately wrong. He was holding my hand, the only part of me I could move, and saying, "It's okay, you're okay, I'm right here." But his reassurance couldn't reach me through the terror. The medical staff didn't react to my distress at all. Maybe they thought it was normal. Lots of women panic during C-sections. Maybe they were too focused on getting the baby out safely to register that this was something different. Or maybe they just didn't care. But my hands were strapped down and I couldn't speak, and the medical team was focused on getting the baby out safely. Brian could see something was wrong. I was wide-eyed and shaking and clearly distressed, but he didn't understand. I was trying to tell him. I have no idea how I got through that surgery. I have no memory of the actual birth, no recollection of hearing my son cry for the first time or seeing him for the first time. All I remember is the terror, the feeling of suffocation, the certainty that I was going to die on the table, just like I'd been certain I was going to die 12 years earlier. My body shook for hours afterward. The nurses thought it was a reaction to the anesthesia, but I knew better. It was my first major PTSD episode since that night in 1993, and it happened at what it should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. I didn't talk about that incident again for years. Not with Brian, not with my therapist, not with anyone. It felt like another failure, that I couldn't even give birth without my trauma inserting itself into what should have been a joyful moment. It wasn't until the pandemic, when masks became mandatory and I found myself having panic attacks the first time I had to wear one, that I finally told Brian what had really happened in that operating room. And he stayed on the phone with me while I cried and said he wished he'd known and wished he'd understood what I was trying to tell him, wished he could have made them take the mask off my face. But by then, Crew was 14 years old and the moment had long since passed. When they finally brought my son to me, when I could hold him without shaking, when the trauma response had finally subsided enough for me to focus on his face, I saw Kier. Not a resemblance, not a family similarity. Kier's face, exactly as I remembered it from those precious 2 hours in the hospital 11 years earlier. It should have been beautiful. It should have felt like a gift, like Kier's spirit somehow living on in this new baby. Instead, it felt like torture. Even days later, when Nate saw a picture of Crew, he said what I'd been thinking since the moment I first held my son. They look like twins, him and Kier. And he was right. The resemblance was uncanny. Not just similar, identical in ways that should have been impossible for babies born 12 years apart to different fathers. A few close friends have seen a side-by-side of both of my boys, and they can't believe it either. It was like the universe was giving me a chance to see what Kier might have looked like growing up. A chance to experience all the moments with Crew that had been stolen from me with Kier. But in those early days, that resemblance felt more like torture than a gift. Every time I looked at my son, I saw the baby I'd lost. Every time I held him, I remembered holding Kier's lifeless body. Every time he cried, I was reminded of the silence that had surrounded Kier's birth. And from that moment on, I was fearful, irrationally fearful. Something would happen to him, and something would take him away from me too. I couldn't separate this living, healthy baby from the dead one I'd never stopped grieving. The postpartum depression hit like a truck. I'd expected to feel overwhelmed, exhausted, and emotional, all the normal things new mothers feel. I hadn't expected to feel like I was drowning, like I couldn't connect with my own child, like I was failing at the most basic job a mother is supposed to have. I loved my son. I knew I loved him, but I couldn't feel that love through the fog of depression and trauma and grief that had settled over me like a thick blanket. Brian was recovering from his own surgeries, trying to help with the baby while managing his own healing. He could see that I was struggling, but neither of us understood the depth of what I was dealing with. It's just the baby blues, I told myself. It'll pass. You need to give it time. But weeks passed, then months, and instead of getting better, I felt like I was getting worse. Crew had spent his first few days in the NICU, which should have been terrifying as well, but was actually almost a relief. It meant I could visit him when I felt strong enough and leave when the waves of depression and anxiety became too much. It meant I could love him in small doses, while I figured out how to love him fully. In hindsight, I did love him fully. So much I was too overprotective. The NICU nurses were wonderful, patient and understanding, and completely unfazed by a new mother who sometimes had to leave the room to cry in the hallway. This is harder than people think it is, one of them told me. Don't be so hard on yourself. But being hard on myself was the only thing I knew how to do. I'd spent years learning to blame myself for things that weren't my fault. Adding failing as a new mother one more time to that list felt almost inevitable. The truth was, I was devastated that Crew was in the NICU, not because I didn't want to bond with him, but because I was terrified. Terrified that something would happen to him, like it had happened to Kier. Terrified that loving him fully would mean losing him fully. Terrified that I'd already failed him by bringing him into a world where babies I loved didn't get to stay. I knew I didn't want to lose him again. That again haunted me, as if Crew and Kier were the same person, as if history was destined to repeat itself, as if loving a son meant inevitably watching him die. The fear was irrational, but it was real, and it shaped those early weeks in ways I couldn't control. When we finally brought our son home, when he was healthy and thriving in everything we'd hoped for, I should have felt relieved, grateful, complete. Instead, I felt like I was living someone else's life, playing the role of happy new mother while feeling completely disconnected from the experience. I don't even remember the exact moment when I first bonded with Crew as himself, rather than as a reminder of Kier. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, more like a slow thaw, a gradual warming toward the baby in my arms, rather than the ghost I kept seeing in his features. Maybe it was the first time he smiled, really smiled, not just gas or reflexes, but a genuine response to seeing my face. Maybe it was the way he'd calmed down when I held him, like he knew I was his mother, even when I wasn't sure I knew how to be one. Maybe it was just time and mental health support and Brian's patient insistence that I was a good mother, even when I couldn't see it myself. But slowly, I stopped seeing Kier when I looked at Crew. I started seeing Crew, this unique, wonderful person who happened to look like his brother, but was entirely his own person. And once I could see him clearly, once the fog of depression and grief began to lift, I fell completely in love with my son. Not in spite of how he looked, not by pretending he didn't remind me of Kier, but by learning to hold both truths simultaneously. That he carried his brother's face when he was new, and that he was beautifully, completely himself. I felt gratitude that some part of Kier lived on in this world. Gratitude that I got to experience the love I'd never been able to give. Gratitude that life had given me a second chance at the motherhood that had been ripped away from me so violently. It took time. It took work. It took learning to hold joy and grief simultaneously, to love fully while still carrying loss. But I got there. And my son, healthy, thriving, completely himself, became the proof that sometimes the hardest things lead to the most beautiful outcomes. Postpartum depression after trauma is incredibly complex. When pregnancy and childbirth trigger PTSD, when new babies remind you of babies you've lost, when what should be joyful becomes painful, that's not your fault. That's trauma intersecting with one of life's most vulnerable experiences. If you've ever struggled to bond with a baby because of your own history, if you've ever felt guilty for not feeling the right emotions at the right times, please know that healing isn't linear. Love isn't always immediate, and getting help isn't giving up. It's giving your child the gift of a mother who's committed to her own healing. So this chapter is one of the most complicated intersections of grief, trauma, and hope I've ever lived through. Looking back on it now, how many emotional realities were happening at the same time, and how none of them canceled the others out. you can be grateful and terrified, and you can be hopeful and grieving, and you can love a baby and still struggle to connect because trauma has rewired the way that your body interprets danger, right? And that's, I think, the heart of this particular chapter, how the body keeps score even when you think you've moved forward. People love to imagine that a pregnancy after loss is healing, but for many of us, it's really just a great big huge fucking minefield. Every new milestone echoes the old wounds, and every moment of joy is kind of shadowed by this fear, you know? And then Brian's medical crisis on top of it. When someone you love suddenly becomes fragile, your entire sense of safety collapses. And I'd already lived through unbearable loss, in my opinion. I knew what life looked like, when the ground kind of disappears from beneath you. So facing the possibility of losing him at the exact moment, like it was 24 hours, that I'd learned I was pregnant again, it felt impossible to process. It was like being asked to survive 2 lifetimes of fear in just one single day. What I understand now, obviously, is that life rarely gives us clean emotional lines, right? Sometimes joy and terror arrive together, and you have no freaking choice but to hold them both. You're being tested. Sometimes the universe hands you everything you've ever wanted and everything you're most afraid of all at once. Another moment that still resonates too is what happened in the operating room during my C-section. This trauma resurfaced without warning. I didn't think they were putting oxygen into me. This mask, right? A lot of people don't realize how common it is, though, when trauma resurfaces. Childbirth can trigger old memories in ways that feel physical and unavoidable, right? These sensory details and this inability to move. I felt like I was trapped. And that yanked me into the past before I even realized what was happening. And that's why PTSD during childbirth is so underdiscussed and so deeply misunderstood. Woven through all of this, too, was the fear that I wouldn't bond with Crew, not because I didn't love him, but because love had become this dangerous thing for me. It still kind of was, I guess. Losing a child teaches you that nothing's guaranteed. And bonding felt like stepping into how about onto a frozen lake that I wasn't sure would hold my weight, right? And when your new baby resembles the child you lost, the emotional math becomes impossible. But what I've learned and what I want every one of you to hear, that bonding doesn't need to be immediate to be real. We're told lies about that too. Put the baby on mom's bare chest, so that they can bond immediately because it has to happen in that exact moment. That's not true. Sometimes love grows in the spaces where fear used to live, right? And connection is slow because your brain is simply trying to protect you. And that's not failure at all. It's a form of survival, I think. And now here we are. This episode airs on April 6th, one day after Crew turns 20 years old. 20. Every time I say it, I still feel that mix of awe and disbelief. There were moments from this chapter where I truly didn't know if I'd get to watch him grow up. And I didn't know if I'd get to celebrate his first steps or his first words or first heartbreaks or the moment he towered over me, which he does. Trauma told me not to get attached, right? Fear told me not to hope too loudly. But here he is, and here we are. Yeah, looking back at this chapter, knowing the man he's become, it's kind of surreal to me. It's a reminder, I think, that some of the most beautiful parts of life are on the other side of moments that you barely survive, right? Sometimes the baby you're afraid you might not bond with becomes one of the people who teaches you the most about love and resilience and forgiveness. This chapter is messy and it's raw because that season of life was messy and raw, but it's also the beginning of a story that didn't end in fear. It grew and it evolved and it shaped me into a mother I wasn't sure I could be. And now, 20 years later, I can look at Crew and see not just what I survived, but what came from it. A life, a relationship, a whole ass human who's still teaching me what healing looks like. He's never understood my overprotectiveness. He knows he has a big brother, who died before he was born. He knows he knows bits and pieces of what's happened to me. He knows I was raped. but he's never really understood my overprotectiveness. And a lot of it kind of comes from that place of, what I experienced with losing Kier. And I don't know, I guess as he's getting older, maybe he starts to understand it a little bit more. I'm not sure. He still teases me a lot about it, and I'm okay with the teasing now. I used to be really defensive about it, but yeah. I guess that's it. Thank you so much for being here. Please make sure to follow me wherever you listen to me, so when new episodes come out, you'll be notified. All episodes of Unbound are free, but if you want to support the production costs, or if, you feel this is helping you in any way, you can find me on Ko-fi, but there's never any obligation. This content will always be free because barriers to healing shouldn't be financial. All the support and contact info is in the show notes, and if you join the Facebook group, we sometimes have further discussion over there, and sometimes giveaways and other fun things mentioned in the off-script episodes. So I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/Unbound Podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.